Before I get started with tonight's lecture, is there any questions anyone has about any of the assignments or the class in general, or any other questions I can answer? Okay, I'll take that as no questions, and so we'll launch right into our class here. And I'm going to share the screen with these PowerPoints. All right, so tonight we're starting off and on biology and behavior. Hopefully you all can see all this stuff. So one of the things that we are always wondering about, the age-old question for humanity is the nature versus nurture question. How much of our behavior is biologically driven, is just a product of our genetics, a product of our brains? Is that all we are? Or are we just a very complex animal who just so happens to have this thing we call self-awareness or consciousness, and that's it? Or is there something more? And then how much of our behavior, how much of who we are as a person can be attributed to the nurture question, which is our environment and how we're raised and who we're raised with and all of that sort of thing. You all have heard that argument before, I'm sure, or have you? I get some thumbs up and some nods, and so, yeah, it sounds like you've probably heard that before, and most have. But tonight we're going to be focusing on the biological questions and what biologically drives us and how that plays a part in our overall behavior and psychological makeup. So we're going to be answering some of these questions tonight and look at it from a neurochemical kind of basis. And I find this very interesting myself because I've always thought the brain was a fascinating organ in our bodies, and how does it work, and what is its basis and in shaping really who we are in a lot of ways. And it's more of a complex question than you would think. There have actually been cases where people were born with half a brain, an entire part of their hemisphere was missing. There was even a case of a man who was otherwise completely normal. There was no indication that anything was going on with him, and he was missing 90% of his brain. His entire cerebral cortex almost was gone, and most of the volume of his brain, or the volume of his skull cavity, was just cerebral spinal fluid. So that's kind of fascinating, and that begs the question then what are we really? Because in a lot of ways, we think of ourselves as being brain driven. But in reality, we know that, except for those isolated cases, that for the most of us, our brains do create a lot of our behavior. One of the things my dad asked me when I first started working in psychology and I was about to finish school, he said, "Does your brain control you, or do you control the brain?" And, it's kind of a funny question in some ways, but it's also a profound question because it's very much true. How much of our unconscious processes, how much of the biochemical electroconductivity of the brain is compelling us to behave, and how much of it is really free will. So your slide here, we're talking about behavior and mental processes are based on biology, but not all those processes. But those processes are also influenced by the environment, as we had talked about earlier. And you have two basic systems in your body, the nervous system and the endocrine system, which are both very important. So neurons, and what do they do? So there's three functions really in the nervous system. Here is a person, they're laying in the bed, and suddenly they hear the sound of the alarm on. How many of you, once you get used to getting up on a regular basis to an alarm at a given time, how many of you have woken up just a minute or two before the alarm goes off. Has that ever happened to you? Yeah, a few of you have. So because of that, you know, your body itself starts creating sleep cycles because it knows you're training it to know exactly when you're going to be waking up. So here you got the input, which is the sound of the alarm clock. So your sensory system and your auditory system picks up the sound. Your brain processes it, so you know what that sound means. And then you have the output, which is your brain directs your arm and hand muscles to reach out and shut that alarm off or throw it or whatever you're going to do waking up early in the morning. So neurons have the ability to send and receive signals. By signals, they mean electrical signals. Glial cells, now they once thought that glial cells really didn't do a whole lot in the brain other than just serve as a supportive function for the neurons. But now they are finding more and more and more that the glial cells actually have their own communication system, as well as assisting neurons in communicating as well. One of the things that are so fascinating about looking up and really reading a lot about neuroanatomy and neuroscience is that every single week we are discovering something new. It's really fascinating. Have any of you got a chance to hear about, or did you see Elon Musk's presentation with his company Neuralink, and how he was talking a little bit about how he's creating a brain chip you can put in your brain that's supposed to be able to, at first, help people who are, for example, paraplegic, perhaps move again, so help the motor areas, or even at some point, his long-range goal is to be able to download information directly to your brain, which would be both fascinating and a little bit on the scary side. But it's really fascinating. Science fiction is becoming science fact, and if you have a chance to see that presentation, it's really interesting. So glial cells, again, help neurons communicate. They have some functions similar to neurons, and but their malfunctions may lead to problems. One of the things that they think actually might cause different kinds of neuro disorders like Alzheimer's disease or even Parkinson's is a failure of the glial cells to do their whole job. And part of what some of those cells do that we'll get to, I think later on in this presentation, is they actually help to kind of sweep away the excess proteins in the snipped off parts of the neurons. That every single day, as you're forming new memories, you have cells that their specific job is to what it's called doing neuropruning. So you're pruning the neurons and pruning the dendrites, which are the elongated little branches that come off the neuron body. And that pruning creates a waste buildup in the brain, and you have to have some of that swept away, and then it gets carried out of your body and eliminated as a waste product. But when that process doesn't work correctly, then it builds up. You get things like beta amyloid plaques. You get protein built up. You get a lot of different problems that create different disorders. So here's what the neuron looks like, or at least it's an artistic representation of it. You got your cell body. You got the axon, which is the long branch here, long trunk of the neuron. You got the axon terminal where the synapse and the neighboring neurons occur. This is where it's connected. The dendrites is how the neuron communicates with other neurons in the body. You have the nucleus inside the cell body, the mitochondria, which is
powerhouse of the cell.
What is it? Very good, very good. Yeah, exactly right. So, and then you have the outer membrane of the neuron as well. And outside of your brain and your spinal cord, Do any of you know where the next largest concentration of neurons are in your body? Believe it or not, it's in your gut. It's in your digestive system. You know, even some of our sayings like, I really felt that in my gut, or I knew there was something wrong. I knew it in my gut. In fact, there's so many neurons in your body that some scientists have theorized that you kind of have a second brain in your digestive system that might even be processing information. So that's kind of fascinating if you think about it. So the communication between neurons happens both as a biochemical process as well as an electrical process. First, you have this thing called the action potential, which is an electroconductivity that shoots down the axon away from the cell body. Then you have a neurotransmitter, and we'll talk a little bit about that later in the lecture as well. But neurotransmitters are things like serotonin and norepinephrine. And those neurotransmitters are released, and they have a very specific job in communicating a certain kind of information to the next neuron in the chain. And this all happens inside the synaptic cleft. And the synaptic cleft is this part here. And the neurons or the dendrites don't quite physically touch. There's actually a tiny space in between. And then you have the neurotransmitters that are released in these vesicles. The transmitters are released and they fit into the receptor sites, similar to how a key, which is the neurotransmitter, fits into a lock. Although now there is some even controversy about that. That's like the old traditional model, but some recent studies have suggested that it's not quite like a lock and key as much as it is more like a puzzle piece or creating a new action potential. So if there's a receptor for the neurotransmitter on the dendrites, the neurotransmitters will bind to the receptor and it creates an electrochemical signal. And if the signal is strong enough, it spreads down the dendrites and across the cell body of the next neuron and begins another action potential. So when I consciously say, you know, either through an impulse or, you know, raise your right hand. Okay, here goes my hand, it raised. And there was a whole series of probably hundreds of thousands of neurons from my brain, through my spinal cord, down through my arm that were all interconnected that were able to cause that movement, which seems very simple on the human level. But if you've ever attempted to program a robot, or you've ever seen how much code is involved in helping a robot learn something that's as simple as walking, you realize how actually complex something that looks very simple really is. So here's another representation of what the synapse may look like close up. So the gap junctions in the synapse is a specialized contact point between neurons for electrical communication. They're also called electrical synapses, and they allow clusters of neurons to fire together, may contribute to the process of learning, may be involved in seizure activity for epilepsy. The reason they talk about it causing seizure activity is what's really interesting is that when you look at your brain wave patterns in a normal brain, meaning someone who is being able to communicate and appears to function like you would expect a human being to function, their electrical conductivity brain patterns look very chaotic and disorganized. A seizure activity often will have a more organized pattern to it than normal electrical processes. And what they have found is that once seizure activity begins in a certain part of the brain, because it travels from one neuron to another, that seizure activity actually becomes almost infectious in some way, in an electrical sense, and it travels across the brain, sometimes across the corpus callosum, which is a bundle of fibers between your two hemispheres of your brain. And that's what causes the seizure activity. The electrical seizure activity takes over the normal productive functions of the brain generally. So here's the organization of the nervous system. You have your central nervous system, which is your brain and your spinal cord that goes on down here. This is without a doubt the most important part of your nervous system. You can't really live without this part, and your body won't function without it. Here's your peripheral nervous system, and that is divided into the somatic and the autonomic. The somatic nervous system you can think of as being the part of your nervous system that is within your conscious control, typically. Although there's been a lot of studies to show that people who are able to meditate over time can actually gain control over their autonomic nervous system. And your autonomic nervous system is divided into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The sympathetic nervous system is the part of your nervous system that is needed when you have the fight or flight response that occurs. Has any of you heard of that before? Does anyone give me an example of the fight or flight response?
It's like when you sense danger and your first instinct is to either run away from it or to confront it.
Absolutely. Yeah, and there's a whole chain reaction that happens where both your nervous system and your endocrine system are involved in that response. I have experienced the fight or flight response both in my city dwelling experience. When you see someone creeping up on you, you're not quite sure what to do, and you decide to run. Or I've had that experience when I've been hiking up on the Appalachian Trail in the mountains, and you hear a growl coming from the bushes. You don't know where the growl exactly is coming from, but you're not going to wait around to find out, you know. Or you may have that experience if you decide to, you're cornered and you have no choice but to fight, either a person or an animal. So that's the sympathetic nervous system. Your parasympathetic nervous system is the part of your autonomic nervous system that is helps you to relax. So, you know, if you imagine yourself on a beach and, you know, you had a couple of Coronas in you and you are listening to the waves and you got your absolutely best person next to you that you cherish and love very much, and you're looking over at them and life is good and you're taking deep breaths and you've got a calm heart rate, you're digesting your food. That's the parasympathetic nervous system at work. So the peripheral nervous system, you keep in touch with the world, sights and sounds, how do they reach your brain? Your sensory system, you know, you are familiar with your five senses, but we actually have more than that. You also have a kinesthetic sense, which is a sense in that allows you to know where your body is at any given time in time and space. So, you know, you could close your eyes and not be able to see it, but then if I said, point to your toe, or, you know, show me your big toe, or touch your right big toe, you'd be able to do that without any issue. And so that's both the sense of touch as well as your kinesthetic senses. And then your sense of balance, you know, that's your vestibular sense. Part of that is included from signals that are constantly coming from little crystals that are in the inner ear of your brain, as well as visually organizing kind of where you are in time and space. And then, of course, you got sight and sound, taste, touch, and hearing. All of those comprise your major sensory experiences. So the sensory information goes through the central nervous system for processing, and it sends messages from your central nervous system to muscles to direct motion or to respond to something going on in your environment. So the autonomic nervous system controls activities normally not under conscious control. We talked about that a little bit. Your sympathetic nervous system is the one that spends energy. Your parasympathetic is the one that preserves energy. So fight or flight, or in sympathetic, parasympathetic, relax. The central nervous system makes sense in how your brain is wired. We talked about central nervous system consists of your brain and spinal cord, and that's fiber tracts or bundles of axons that travel together. Your spinal cord is very much that way, but so is a lot of the nervous system bundles throughout your digestive system as well. So the spinal cord receives signals from senses and passes them through the brain, and carries signals from the brain to the muscles and can direct simple behaviors without the brain's involvement, known as reflexes. So if you've ever been at the doctor's office and a doctor checks your knee reflex, and he's got a little rubber hammer and he hits your knee and your knee pops up, and it's without your conscious control. That's a reflex. So you have a similar experience if you've ever touched a hot stove, and you actually had the experience when you touched the hot stove before you even registered that it was painful or that it was hot. You probably saw your hand jerk back. You know, that's a reflexive experience. So the reflexive pathway is really from the area where the reflex, like the knee, hits the spinal cord, and then there's a feedback from the spinal cord. And then your brain register is at a few seconds later, a few milliseconds later, depending on how you experience that. So in the brain, it's your most complex part of your central nervous system. You got three major subdivisions: your hind brain, which is behind your midbrain in the middle, and then your forebrain is on top. You got major structures of the brain. So your cerebellum, for example, is an area of your brain. It looks like a little cabbage, the way it is organized. But a lot of your sense of balance and how to actually do physical activities, like use a hammer, ride a bicycle, knowing what button to push on a blender, even, a lot of that is encoded in your cerebellum. Your reticular formation, this is part of your brain stem. Some of that has to do with breathing, digesting. Some of it's is even emotional responses. The medulla oblongata. If you've ever seen the Waterboy with Adam Sandler, there's a great scene in there that I usually show about the medulla oblongata. I'll have to post that on web courses for you. And then you got the spinal cord here. The locus coeruleus, that's a little bit upper part of your brain stem. This is the part that connects your brain to the spinal cord. So the hindbrain lies just behind the skull, or just inside the skull. It's a continuation of the spinal cord. You got the medulla, which, as we said, regulates heart rate, blood pressure, breathing. The reticular formation controls arousal and attention. And arousal is not only meaning sexual arousal, it also means just having the ability to, be alert and get up and move around and have some motivation to get going in the morning. The locus coeruleus, it directs attention. So if you, there's some thought that, this might be an underacted part or under aroused part of the brain that might have something to do with the attention deficit disorder. Cerebellum controls fine motor skills, like we talked about, riding a bicycle, or using a hammer. eye tracking, learning, recall of skilled movements. So fencing or catching a ball or knowing how to dribble a basketball, all of those are part of your cerebellum. Impulse control, which also is also mediated, strangely enough, by your frontal lobes, your emotions and your and some language abilities, but mostly the mechanics part of language abilities. You know, when you are talking, if you become really self-aware of what's actually happening when you are talking, you almost start slurring your words a little bit, but you can feel your tongue moving, you can feel your vocal cords modulating, and you can feel your lips moving, all in a complex series of motions that give rise to these sounds that we have learned to connect with meaning, or what we know is language. So the midbrain lies above the hindbrain. Together with parts of the hindbrain forms the brain stem, helps produce smooth movements. So here's the major structures of the forebrain. You got the hypothalamus that connects to and from the autonomic nervous system and is involved in regulating hunger, thirst, and your sex drive. The corpus callosum, I'll show you a picture from above in a little while, but that's actually a bundle of fibers that connect your two hemispheres, your left and your right hemisphere of your brain. Your cerebral cortex, this is the largest part of your brain that sits on top of all the other structures of your brain. There's some thought that the cerebral cortex is the last, or was the last part of our brains to develop evolutionarily. We share a lot of our brain structures on the lower regions with reptiles, and then higher regions we share, and lower regions we share with mammals. And the more complex the animals are, the more cerebral cortex they have. Dolphins and whales and such also have a fairly large cerebral cortex. Not sure what they're thinking about, or if they've developed any complex calculus. Maybe they have. They're just not communicating with us. Who knows about it? They may have their own plans surrounding the whole thing. But cerebral cortex responsible for processing complex information, like this lecture, for example, which may not be complex for some, but is complex in the greater scheme of things. Then you got the thalamus, the septum, the amygdala. That's an emotional regulation part. May also have to do with a lot of anger control issues are in there. And you have the hippocampus that helps to shuttle short-term memories into longer-term memories. So the forebrain controls most complex aspects of behavior and mental life. An outer surface called the cerebral cortex, the hypothalamus and thalamus help to operate basic drives, emotions, and sensations. The thalamus acts as a relay station for pain and sense organ signals, except for smell. Smell is the only sensation that does not go through the thalamus or other brain structures. The sense of smell is hardwired directly into your cerebral cortex and into your overall brain as a whole. Probably because the sense of smell was probably one of the very first senses to ever arise in our ancient ancestors. It's one of the ones that we can detect quite readily. Humans actually have a pretty good sense of smell. We can detect different senses, even within a large room or something that's happened across the room. Hypothalamus helps regulate hunger, thirst, and sex drive. So the amygdala and hippocampus help regulate memory and emotion, as we talked about. The amygdala links different types of sensory information and memory, such as shape and the feel of objects. So, you know, you see an object kind of like this. So this is not trying to advertise polar seltzer water, but I do tell you, this is some really good quality seltzer water if you do like it. But, you know, a can of soda like this has a certain shape, a certain feel, a certain texture to it. You know, you can kind of hear it a little bit. This is kind of like those Asmar Do y'all listen to those on YouTube? It's kind of interesting. But even without seeing it, just from feeling it, feeling its weight, how it bends to my touch, that tells me that I'm dealing with a can here. And that's true of a lot of other objects. If you're like me, you may carry a lot of objects in your pocket. You know, I routinely, being a Southern boy, carry a pocket knife. I got my keys in there. I may have my glasses. But I know just from touch what each one of those are. And that's a big part of that is regulated by the amygdala. So the hippocampus helps form new memories and the ability to imagine future events. There is a specific disorder called Korsakoff syndrome that people who have overindulged in alcohol over the course of their life, so you have to have many years of overindulging in alcohol, will develop certain B vitamins deficiencies. And we know that deficiencies in vitamins B1 and 2 and 12 especially can help to degenerate the neurons in the hippocampus and weaken it to the point where a person has the inability then to form long-term memories or to even learn new things. They become Mr. or Mrs. short-term memory. And that's a form of dementia called alcohol-induced dementia or Korsakoff syndrome. But it's easily prevented by making sure that a person is not having an excessive number of drinks. That's like maybe one or at most two a day. And talking about beers or a glass of wine or a single like 1 ounce shot of liquor. And making sure you're getting plenty of B vitamins. So the cerebral cortex is further divided into different areas. You get the frontal lobes here. So all of this area just above your eyes going all the way back to the central part of your brain where your motor strip starts back here in your sensory strip is all part of your frontal lobes. Your frontal lobes also contain what's known as your executive planning center, your abilities to create complex plans, project yourself into the future, understand what's going to happen next, and the ability to plan and reason about the events in the environment and to make a lot of different complex decisions, all are contained in your frontal lobes. Guess what part of your brain is most affected when you drink a lot of alcohol and you're buzzed or you're drunk? Your frontal lobes. That's right. And because of that, a lot of people think that alcohol is a stimulant because when the frontal lobes get shut down and suppressed, a person's ability to inhibit their impulses is greatly diminished. And then people begin behaving in ways they would not otherwise have behaved before because they no longer have the inhibitions. But it's not a stimulant, as we know, it's actually a depressant. But it appears to be that way at certain points in your inebriation because of the frontal lobes. Your temporal lobes are the areas just above your ears to either side of your skull. And if you are right-handed, you encode your language typically in the left side of your brain. So most of your language abilities, knowing how to talk, how to understand language, your receptive language skills, as well as your expressive language skills, are encoded in your temporal lobe. If you're left-handed, then it's largely encoded in the right side of your brain. And for people who are ambidextrous, they encode in both. Women also tend to encode in both language in both sides of their brain as well. Men tend to be more preferential, just one of those peculiarities about gender differences in the brain. The parietal lobe is this part just to the upper region of your brain, contains part of the sensory motor cortex, and then also does a lot of different work in the whole areas of your brain for your mathematical skills. It processes visual spatial organization, where, those sorts of things. Einstein's parietal lobes were more developed than the usual person. He actually didn't want his brain studied. He specifically put in his will to not allow his brain to be studied, but guess what they did? As soon as he died, they did the autopsy, they popped his brain out, and they sent it off to study against what his original wishes were. But it's also sort of like the chicken and egg part. He was so interested in how the world worked, interested in mathematics, interested in cosmology, which uses a lot of both mathematical abilities as well as visual spatial kind of references, that perhaps that grew his parietal lobe larger than it would otherwise have been. The occipital lobe, that's that part of your brain back here, and that contains the visual cortex. So within the temporal lobe over here, you have Broca's area, you have the auditory cortex, you have Wernicke's area. All of these have to do with language production as well as language understanding or comprehension. So association cortex is in your frontal lobe, your motor cortex right here, the very last part of your frontal lobe, somatosensory cortex. You have a portion of your brain that is dedicated to every single component of your body, from your little toe to the last follicle on your head, has a representation somewhere on the somatosensory cortex, so that when it's touched, that part, it lights up, and your brain registers it as there. The association cortex, again, that's your parietal lobe, and where a lot of visual spatial organization processing takes place. So here's your motor sensory cortex. As I talked about, you have every single piece or part of your body is represented somewhere on your brain. And what's fascinating is that there's certain parts of your body, like your tongue, for example, your lips, your face, they get a lot more dedicated space in the brain than smaller areas like your ankle or your knee, which perhaps evolutionarily might not have been as important. Now you think about how many muscles we have in our face and how many different facial expressions, even very subtle facial expressions, that people give, and how much information that you're able to receive by watching that. One of the things that I found really fascinating through this year with the whole COVID response is people wearing the mask in a lot of different places, and I watch them and I hear them talking. I realize how much information that I'm missing by not being able to see a lot of their facial expressions. And so I'm having to have them repeat things. Makes me realize how much I am relying upon watching their lips move or seeing their facial expression to even understand the context of what they're saying. Really interesting. So you have the motor area here dedicated to moving different parts. You have the sensory area dedicated to feeling and the sense of touch, knowing where those parts of the body are on the body at any given time. All right, so here's the case of the disembodied woman. What was the researcher's question? They said, why was a seemingly normal, healthy young woman falling and dropping things? So how did the researcher answer the question? First of all, was it a conversion disorder? Does anyone know what conversion disorder is? Have you ever heard that before? They used to call that hysteria back in Freud's day. Now, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the 5th edition, calls it neurogenic conversion disorder, but it's just plain old conversion disorder, really. What conversion disorder really is that when a person has some kind of traumatic event or a very strong emotional reaction to something, it sometimes gets translated into a physical manifestation. So a good example that I had one time when I was working at the hospital was there was a man who walked in and to the emergency room with every stroke symptom that you could possibly have checked off in the textbook. I mean, droopy face, slurred words, cognitive issues, half of his body completely paralyzed. And so he had a stroke, what it seemed like. They did an MRI on him, and the MRI actually came back pretty clear. But that's not entirely unusual, as we'll get to later in the slides. Not every imaging that occurs, or not all the MRIs, are actually perfect. Sometimes they do miss things, or sometimes there's damage that the MRI might not be picking up. But come to find out later on, when he got into the hospital, he was sent over to me for an evaluation. And I discovered that he actually had not had the chance to mourn his wife's death. He had been together with the same woman for about 35 years, and they were very close. And when she died, he was in the process of moving. And so he continued his moving, and the normal mourning process kind of got interrupted. And then finally, it because he didn't deal with it, it erupted in this physical manifestation. So over the next couple of weeks, while he was in the hospital, and he was getting physical therapy and such, just as if he had had a stroke. They continued to treat it as such. But we also did psychotherapy. And the more he worked on mourning the death of his wife, the better his stroke symptoms got. So, that's a good example of a conversion disorder. But this particular case that we're talking about now, the case of the disembodied woman, wasn't a conversion disorder. And so they did a careful study of the woman. And what they found was there was a degeneration of the sensory neurons. And what that meant was her sense of knowing that she was actually grasping an object, that, she knew that she was holding these objects in her hands, and she could feel the weight of the object. She knew how much pressure she was putting on the object with her grip. She knew about how heavy the object was. All of that was beginning to dissipate. And so it was causing her to drop these items. So the sense we have in our body is provided partly through a process called proprioception. So that's the sense of knowing that we're holding something, knowing the weight and feel of it and all of that. So we know that vitamins like B6 can do damage to sensory neurons. So what treatments do you think might help to combat that? The most obvious one is give her some vitamins, right? Give her some B vitamins, and make sure that we can kind of get some repair to it. But another treatment that they often will do for these sorts of things, or they'll do occupational therapy and physical therapy, where you'll kind of have to relearn how to hold things. You have to do it in a much more conscious way rather than the automatic way that a lot of us have learned how to do that. So there's a lot of different techniques for studying the brain. There is the EEG, and you may have seen that in movies sometimes. They'll put a lot of different sensors on a person's head, and it's actually picking up in real time the electrical impulses of the brain. And then it's transmitted out into a graph, and we learn how to read that and know that certain EEG output means certain things. They can even tell, there's even a difference between the EEG output of someone who is asleep, as opposed to someone who's in a coma, as opposed to someone who's awake. So neurologists learn how to kind of look at all these different things. The PET scan, positron emission tomography, is a complex kind of scan that is done to look at the brain's glucose use in real time. And there's a thought that as the brain is consuming nutrients, it's doing that in different areas that are most active. And so we can see the brain as it's active. Magnetic resonance imaging, they used to call this nuclear magnetic resonance imaging, but then they found that no one wanted to get into a big tube that had the name nuclear in it. So they dropped the nuclear, and now it's just magnetic resonance imaging. But this is a much more complex kind of picture of your brain. The functional MRI is similar to the PET scan in that it is seeing the brain working in action. The DTI is a little less, I guess, complex, or a little less detailed than some of the other imaging we talked about earlier. And then there's this new technique called TMS, this transcranial magnetic stimulation. TMS is a new treatment they're using now for depression. And there's one theory of depression is that it is actually an under-aroused, underactive brain that's causing the experience of feeling depressed. And so they send very powerful magnetic signals through the brain that helps to stimulate the under-aroused or the understimulated neurons, bring that arousal level back up, and people report a lot of positive feelings when it comes to their emotional state. All right, so the EEG, you put multiple electrodes in the scalp. We talked about that. It's a summation of all the electrical fields resulting from the activity of billions of neurons, and you have billions and trillions of neurons just in your brain alone, much less throughout your whole body. So the advantages is it's very rapid. It detects a lot of different activity. It allows analysis through different stages of cognitive processing. So particularly if a person is attempting to study cognitive processing. But when you're trying to find spatial resolution or what part of the brain is actually active, it doesn't do that very well. And it's sometimes combined with what's known as the MEG, or the magnetic EEG, that gives you a little bit higher resolution when you're trying to take a picture. The PET scan records the location of radioactive substances after they ejected the bloodstream. Typically, they give you a glucose, which is just the basic sugar, and they'll put radioactive isotopes in it, and then we're able to see what's happening in the brain as it's being used. So it shows the amount and localization of the molecule that can be injected in radioactive form, such as neurotransmitters, drugs, or tracers, for blood flow, or even for glucose use, as we talked about. Advantages: allows function and biochemical studies, provides visual image corresponding to anatomy. Disadvantages: requires a lot of exposure to low levels of radioactivity, unfortunately. A little bit more than what you would have with an X-ray, but my understanding is that's getting better and better now, and they're able to have higher contrast with lower doses. Provides better spatial resolution than an EEG, but is not as good as an MRI. And it can't follow rapid changes or changes faster than 30 seconds. An MRI exposes the brain to magnetic fields. You can't get an MRI if you have any kind of metal in your body that is magnetic, or if you have anything magnetic on your body, such as a watch or anything else that might be affected by magnetic fields. Is an incredibly powerful magnetic field I mean, you can drop a necklace from across the room and it will fly over to a MRI machine when it's turned on. They're incredibly loud as well. That's something they never tell you when you go to get an MRI. So, you know, ask for earplugs if they'll let you put them in. Sometimes they won't let you put them in, but sometimes they'll give you silicone ones that aren't affected. But it just depends. Some people who are prone to claustrophobia don't like it, but it does provide a really good high resolution image of brain anatomy and is one of the best ways for detecting damage in a person's brain. And you can get resolution that is very, very detailed, less than 1 millimeter, which is pretty good. Requires no exposure to radioactivity. It's just the magnetic fields. Provides high spatial resolution and provides high temporal resolution. Disadvantages don't really have any other than we could get even more detailed, and we continue to work toward that. So here's a combination of both a PET scan and an MRI. But this line is for reference. That person didn't have an arrow through their head. That's just an artifact or a graphic that the computer put up to show where the spatial resolution of where the brain is. So the functional MRI combines advantages of both the PET scan and the MRI, provides images of changes in blood flow and blood oxygen. It indicates changes in neural activity. These are real fascinating. I've seen these being done in real time in person. There was a study going on over at Orlando Regional Medical Center, and they invited myself and another person who worked as a neuropsychologist over to see this new scan. They were doing some research on it, so it was really kind of fascinating to watch. The DTI is a variant on the fMRI. It shows activity of axon pathways, which sometimes can be helpful for tracing down different damaged part of either the brain or the nervous system. And it shows water flow in neural fibers. Transcranial magnetic stimulation, it temporarily disrupts neural activity of a small region of the brain by exposing it to an intense magnetic field. They've developed a portable, almost gun-like one of these that people who suffer from extreme migraine headaches have been prescribed. And it has a portion of it that fits over the top of a person's head like a semicircle. And then you have basically kind of like a gun grip and a trigger, and you pull the trigger and it shoots the magnetic wave into your brain. And a lot of people have been shown to stop the severe migraine headaches in their tracks with this technology. But the main use for this technology recently has been to help people with depression as far as their treatment, but it also shows the function of a particular brain region by observing the changes after the magnetic stimulation is applied to a specific location. It can be combined with fMRI, and it shows which brain regions are necessary for a given task. And but we don't know what it's doing to us in the long term. We're exposed to magnetic radiation all the time. If you talk on the cell phone and hold it up to your ear, you're exposed to both electromagnetic radiation as well as magnetic radiation. And you're exposed to that every day of your life all the time. So for the most part, we know that most EMS fields are perfectly safe. But what the long-term part of that is, we're not quite sure yet. There doesn't seem to be any disadvantages, but this technology is relatively new, and most human beings haven't been exposed to a lot of it over a long period of time. All right, so here is thinking critically observation. So what can the fMRI tell us about behavior and mental processes? So the real question, you know, we can see all of these really amazing pictures being given in an MRI, but what does that really mean when it comes to interpreting behavior, when it comes to interpreting thought, when it comes to trying to figure out exactly what part of the brain does what, and how that happens. Most of what we know about how the brain functions was originally developed by studying people who are brain damaged. So, you know, we saw a person and they got a stroke in their temporal lobe, in that Broca area or that Wernicke's area, and then suddenly they have speech problems. So the inference is, oh, well, that part of the brain probably then has to do with language function, because when that part of the brain is damaged, we know that then language function is impaired. But is that it? Is that all there is to it? And what a lot of studies have shown, that the brain actually is working not only in terms of a single region doing a single thing, it actually works in terms of circuits. So there may be a feedback loop between my temporal, my occipital, my parietal, and my frontal lobes, all happening simultaneously with all the other different structures of my brain, my thalamus, my hypothalamus, my amygdala, all of that stuff acting together in concert to create thoughts and these very complex kinds of behaviors that we witness. So not all of the stuff we think of in terms of, well, this part of the brain does this, can be interpreted that way. However, one thing, your slide here says that the fMRI led to discovery of mirror neuron mechanisms. Mirror neurons are really fascinating. What we have found is that when a mother is holding her infant, for example, and the mother and the infant are looking at one another eye to eye, it sets up this sense of a mirror neuron in both the baby as well as the mother. And they've done both MRI as well as EEGs on the mother and the infant, and you'll begin to see their brains and their neurons firing simultaneously. One person fires, the other fires. Another example of a mirror neuron is if you've ever had a cringe moment when you saw a friend fall. So you see a friend fall and you're like, you know, you have this cringe moment. You actually almost experience the pain that they've gone through, or the fear that they may have felt when they fell, you know, and then you may burst into laughter as a way to release all that tension when you realize that they're okay and they're just being a goof. But that's a mirror neuron. Your brain has gone through a similar experience that your friend did, that you, in a way that you observe them, as you observe them falling or maintaining some kind of behavior like that. So we need more evidence about correlations and causation in fMRI research. We can't say definitively exactly what is happening here. And it really also goes to show just really how complex the brain is overall, and how difficult it is to give a one-to-one correlation. Because again, mostly they found that we're working on circuits. So like, here's an example of the functional MRI. And so the MRI is actually able to take pictures in slices of the brain. So this is like starting at the lowest level of your brain down. And if you can imagine taking a slice at that level and you're seeing the brainstem, and then you got your cerebellum, and it's building up as we're rising up in the slices and we're seeing more and more of the brain as we're going through the top, we can see what each part of the brain is doing as the person is being told, think about this, recite a poem that you know, sing a song. So, you know, we know that when a person sings a song and you hear music, you know, your brain goes through a whole bunch of other mental processes that you don't normally go through when you're just speaking. But music and language are very similar to one another. So here is the promised top view of the two hemispheres in the corpus callosum. Now we know that the corpus callosum in women is actually a little bit larger, and women tend to use both sides of their brain more holistically than men. Men tend to be left or right brain dominant, although men do use their whole brain. They tend to use one side more than the other, and they have a smaller corpus callosum. One of the things that women are able to do that men are not able to do is they have a natural ability, although men can learn how to do this, but women have this natural ability because they use more of their brain to process visual, spatial, organizational information, particularly in body language, emotional responses, what a person is saying, how they're saying it, and digest all this information into a very complex kind of ability to know exactly what you're feeling in some level. You may have experienced this if you were raised by your mother or your grandmother or your aunt. You know, you may have walked in to home one day and they said, "Hey, what's wrong?" And you look like you've had a bad day, and what's going on with you? And so what do you think evolutionarily, would that have been advantageous for women, and how? Or for humans generally, really? So like the question is, why would being able to read another person's emotional level, why would that be advantageous? Any guesses? No right or wrong answers either, by the way. I'm just trying to get y'all to participate.
Could it have been because women were typically caretakers?
Yeah, historically women have been caretakers, and so knowing what your baby was feeling, knowing the difference between different cries may have been led to knowing when your baby needed to be fed, knowing when the baby needed to be comforted, knowing when the baby was actually in pain as opposed to the baby just wanting attention. You know, any mother who has had a baby more than a month, sometimes not even a week, can already tell the difference between those different cries. I have two sons, and I quickly learned what those different cries meant myself. I learned that information, but it did not seem for me, as this is my experience, as automatic as it did for my wife. So what about this though? What about generally? Other than caretaking, what other advantage would there be, would someone have if they had the ability to discern or understand another person's emotional state? So you knew the emotional state of an adult. Why would that be advantageous, do you think?
You would be able to like understand like if there was danger or anything nearby without having to just say it, so you could have quicker reaction.
Yeah, it probably led to our survival in some way. Gosh, if you've ever been in a situation where someone got angry, I mean, you can feel it right off the bat, can't you, on some level? You know, that may have been advantageous. So our corpus callosum plays a part in all that kind of processing. But what happens when the corpus callosum has been split or has been cut for some reason? Sometimes they have to actually sever the corpus callosum with people who have very severe epileptic seizures. By severing the corpus callosum, they stop the traveling of the seizure activity across the entire brain, and it actually cures their seizures. But something very strange happens. One of the things that we know from how the brain is organized is we have what's known as contralateral sensory encoding and input. So our left visual field is picked up by our right side of our brain, and the opposite is true. Our right visual field is picked up and processed by the left part of our brain. And so because the left part of our brain has the words or the language for objects, and the right part of our brain has the visual representation as well as the somatic component for it, knowing what it's shaped like, what it feels like, is on the right side of the brain. Typically, in this kind of explanation here, you have a person and they have a blind. So there's objects inside, on the other side of the blind, that they cannot see. They can only touch and feel them. So they reach in and they touch an object. People who have split brains, what's really fascinating is that when you show them a series of photos or a series of pictures of the object they're feeling with their left hand, and remember, that means that their right side of their brain is picking it up, they can point to what object it is. So they know by feel, and they can connect it to the picture that this is a spoon. But when you ask them, tell us the name of the object, they cannot do it with the split brain activity, because even though they have that representation, they know it from the right brain side, the access to the language component for it is no longer accessible because it has been severed. Now, when you remove the blind and both eyes are able to see it, the left brain then fires off and says, that's a spoon. So it's really fascinating. At first glance, you don't know there's anything wrong with that person, but when they're doing these split brain studies, they realize how the brain is actually processing information is quite different than what we once thought about. So the image presented, the left visual field, the person can name the object, but if it's presented only to the right visual field, person cannot describe the object in words, but they know what the object is and they can pick it up out of a group of objects. Really fascinating, isn't it? That's kind of interesting. Interesting how the brain works in that respect. So the conclusions from the split brain studies is that the left hemisphere has primary control over spoken language. And that's, again, that's in a lot of ways for primarily right-handed people, although left-handed people can also have been known to encode their language on the left side as well. Right hemisphere better at tasks involving spatial relationships and doing things like recognizing human faces. Excuse me. However, hemispheric differences should not be exaggerated. Again, our brain tends to work in circuits, not just in parts. The corpus callosum integrates function so the hemispheres can work more closely together. What we are beginning to discover is that the central nervous system is a lot more plastic, meaning it has a greater ability to adapt than what we once thought it did. The trouble with, like, for example, the computer model of the brain, you think about a computer. If you take out the graphics card of your computer, what happens to it? For those of you who are gamers.
Stops working.
What stops working?
Your video output.
Your video output
Yeah,
stops working. That's right. Suddenly, that's no longer available. But what they have discovered is that there can be whole sections of your brain that are missing or even damaged, and other parts of your brain will begin to take up the duties of that part if it's getting the proper stimulation to be able to do that. Your computer can't do that. Once your graphics card is gone, another part of the motherboard isn't going to suddenly start producing visual output. That's just the end of it. They've also learned that you can actually hack a person's brain. You can actually use one part of the body that wasn't intended for that kind of sensory input, and you can rearrange it, and actually in very short time, and that part can begin registering the new electrical activity as a different kind of sensory output. A good example is they did a study where they took a tiny, about a credit card sized plastic disc, and they put all kinds of electrodes along the plastic disc. And this, they led the wires out to a camcorder, and they blindfolded the person, and they put the plastic disc into their mouth. So suddenly their tongue started getting all of these thousands of little tiny electrical impulses at very low levels, at about the same level that your neurons are firing. It's getting all these little electrical impulses to the tongue. Within about 15 minutes, the person actually began being able to see through their tongue. Their brain began to realize that the electrical impulses that it was getting through the tongue were not the taste chemical senses that it normally was getting. It was actually it recognized the electrical impulses as visual input. It reorganized temporarily the part of the brain that had to do with taste, and the person began to describe objects that the camcorder was actually seeing through their tongue. That's brain plasticity. And it's really fascinating that we're able to do that. It's also also a kind of brain hacking. And that's one reason why Elon Musk and the Neuralink company that he founded is so excited about being able to hack the brain in that way with their new computer chip implant, which still blows my mind because it seems like such science fiction. So your slide here says that the central nervous system has the ability to strengthen neural connections at synapses and establish new neural connections, provides the basis for the ability to form new memories and learn new things, and even mental practice of skills or movements can change the brain. It took me about 6 months to learn the ukulele. This is a baritone ukulele, as I was playing to you before. From this valley, they sing, you are leaving, and learn how to play different songs. Playing a musical instrument is a multi-brain kind of ability, because you're having to use motor functions, you're having to use language, you're having to use your auditory sense, you're having to do all of these things in concert, and it sets up a series of very complex circuits throughout your brain that a lot of studies have shown that is just as beneficial for your brain neurocognitively as learning a new language. We know, for example, people who are multilingual. Is anyone here tonight multilingual? Do you speak more than one language? Giovanni does. Giovanni, what do you speak?
I speak Spanish.
Giovanni speaks Spanish and English. And so Giovanni has 2 different layers of language in his representations in his brain. So he has what's known as a larger cognitive reserve. And the more languages you know how to speak, the more information that you learn throughout your life, the more special skills like learning a musical instrument that you're able to do, the larger the cognitive reserve you have, and the further away in time you can push degenerative brain disorders like the dementias, Alzheimer's get pushed further and further back in your age, and to the point where hopefully they never even show up at all. And that's why, and a lot of times, a very intelligent person who has a very vast cognitive reserve, you may not even realize they have Alzheimer's until their 80s or 90s. It may not show up until much, much later if they have the disease at all. Not everyone has those diseases, of course. The CNS may limit the plasticity in repairing brain or spinal cord damage. We're getting better and better in understanding how to provoke the brain or the central nervous system into repairing itself. The goal, obviously, is one of these days is helping to heal. They know that injecting stem cells, either through fetal tissue, which can be controversial in some ways, but they also have learned how to create stem cells from a patient's own body. We know that your stomach lining is very, very, very abundant in stem cells. Stem cells are basic cells that once injected into a certain area of your body, they seem to know what to do next. And when they're injected into the brain or into areas where there is neuro damage, the stem cells organize themselves and grow into neural cells, to new neural cells. And that is the one of the great kinds of developments we're trying to get closer and closer to be able to heal damage from a person who has had neuro damage or even paralysis. So that would be wonderful. Other ways the CNS heals is it blocks inhibitory factors. It promotes action of various growth factors, and even mental and physical exercises can help. We know, like, for example, when a person has had a stroke, the faster they begin rehabilitation. So if you've had a stroke on the right side of your brain, and so the left side of your body has been damaged and is now in paralysis, we know that almost immediately after the stroke, if you begin moving that left side of their body, moving the damaged paralysis part, what you're doing is you're sending signals to the damaged part of the brain. And the brain begins to grow new dendrites, and it will grow the dendrites around the damaged part in the brain and make new connections. And then suddenly, when a person wasn't able to move before, over the days and the weeks and the months of the rehab, they begin to relearn to walk, relearn to move their arms and legs, sometimes even relearn to talk. It's really fascinating. I've seen people come back from really devastating strokes where you think that they're never going to recover, and they do. So sometimes it's incredible what the body is able to heal from. So human development and the changing brain, here's the correlations between changes in neuroactivity and behavior of newborns and infants. So most changes reflect plasticity, not appearance of a new cell. The plasticity allows brains to restructure itself throughout life. There's new connections depending on both genes and experience. Your genetics, how your DNA is structured, has a big part of what those connections are going to look like and how that part is represented. So this is kind of how it looks. And the older you get, the more complex these connections are. Now, you will see it looks more dense at 6 years old because what's happening is there's a pruning effect that happens. And you get pruned certain neurons get pruned away that are no longer necessary, and then you develop a highly specialized set of neural connections and neurocircuits, depending on exactly what kind of behaviors you're doing. You know, did your parents send you to gym class as opposed to piano lessons, or did they do both? Are you kind of prone to being an athlete? Did you like playing soccer and basketball or football? You know, or you're a nerdy guy? Do you like, or nerdy person, nerdy girl? Do you like to read, those sorts of things, or all of the above? None of that's mutually exclusive, of course, but depending on what you're doing, it creates different neurocircuits. All right, so now we're going to look a little bit about the chemistry and behavior of neurotransmitters and exactly what they are. So how do biochemicals affect my mood? So there are three main classes of neurotransmitters. There's very small molecules, there's peptides, and then there's gases. So here are just a few of them. This is not an exhaustive list by no means. There are many, many, and to tell the truth, we continue to discover new ones all the time. But these are the major ones that we have discovered that greatly help to create function really within your nervous system. So the first one there is acetylcholine. You actually can go to the drugstore or the vitamin world or vitamin store and buy choline, which is the precursor to acetylcholine. Back in graduate school, before tests, one time I bought a whole big bottle of choline, and I was giving it to myself as a placebo, thinking it was going to help me remember things a little better. And I had this big, huge bottle that I bought at the vitamin store, like that big, and I had it right on my desk. And my friends were asking me, hey, what is that? I said, it's choline. It's the precursor to acetylcholine. It's going to help me do great on this test. And we're like, give me some. So the guy passed off and everyone was taking choline. Whether or not it really helped us do better on the test, I doubt it did anything at all. But the placebo effect was quite profound because we all did quite well on that particular test. But acetylcholine function is in memory and movement. And there are certain anesthetics or certain drugs that are given to people at times that are acetylcholine inhibitors and can actually inhibit voluntary movement. There are two Alzheimer's drugs that are given to people that are acetylcholine reuptake inhibitors that help to create more acetylcholine present in the brain, and is supposed to help somewhat with memory. One such drug is called Aricept, and you may have heard about that if you have an older person in your life. Norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter that helps to regulate mood, sleep, and learning. It's associated with depression when you have a lower amount of it. The drug Wellbutrin or Effexor affect norepinephrine levels primarily, but they also affect serotonin levels. There's a whole class of antidepressants that do nothing but target serotonin. Those are the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. They're part of the Prozac family. So drugs like Prozac and Zoloft are drugs that are SSRIs, and they create more of a availability of serotonin in your brain that's supposed to help with depression. One of the problems with the serotonin theory of depression, though, or really the neurotransmitter theory of depression generally, is that there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of correlation between people who have a very low level of serotonin and their reported mood. Why do you think there is a difference between a person's subjective mood, how they're actually feeling, as opposed to the actual chemical levels, which is the most objective reading we could possibly do of a person, the chemical levels that are available in their brain or in their nervous system. Why do you think there might be a difference?
It might just have to do with the fact that, I mean, like you said, mood is subjective. So everybody experiences happiness or sadness or any different emotion in different ways. So it may not necessarily, it's not really like an objective way to measure it, whereas the chemical levels are.
Yeah, absolutely. Catherine is certainly on the right track there. What they have found is that even though the chemical levels might be very different, you may have an abundance of serotonin, but feel you have a subjective experience of being very depressed. And the opposite can be true as well. You can have a very low level of serotonin, but feel perfectly fine. What they actually think might be happening with the Prozac class of drugs is that a secondary byproduct of those drugs is they actually promote both neuroactivity as well as dendrite growth. And there's one theory that depression is actually, as we had said earlier, an under-aroused brain and a lack of neural connections. So the more neural connections that can be made, the less subjective experience people have on depression. And they feel like that might be a better model than the old neurotransmitter model of depression. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that is connected with movement as well as the reward circuit. You get a big dopamine rush when you hear your favorite song, when you eat your favorite food, when you see your favorite movie, when you have a mind-blowing, delicious orgasm. All of those are big dopamine blasters on some level. Dopamine is associated with the disease Parkinson's disease, which is a movement disorder, as well as schizophrenia. Schizophrenia seems to be a dopamine issue, and when dopamine is regulated, then a lot of the at least positive symptoms like hallucinations and disorganized thinking of schizophrenia can be solved or even sometimes go away with the medication. GABA has to do with sleep function and movement. You can actually take GABA. There are supplements that you can buy at the vitamin store that help you with sleep. Like melatonin is actually a hormone that helps you to sleep, and it is also associated with GABA production. Also has to do with anxiety. Huntington's disease is a GABA issue, or epilepsy. Glutamate has to do with memory, and you have a glutamate deficit after a big stroke. Peptides like endorphins. Endorphins are natural painkillers. What drug do you think almost exactly mimics an endorphin? We're having a big problem with this particular class of drugs right now.
Opioids.
Opiates, yeah, that's exactly right. Opiates are a class of drug that mimic endorphins. And if you've ever run for a long distance or biked for a long distance or exercised for a long distance, and you start getting little tingles in the back of your neck and you feel your hair standing up and you start getting what's known as the runner's high, that is an endorphin rush. That is your brain saying, oh, I guess we're going to run a while. We might as well feel good while we're doing it, you idiot. And so it releases a lot of endorphins and makes you feel better. Nitrous oxide, also known as laughing gas. Sometimes you get a blast of this when you are at the dentist office to help you relax. Seems to be associated with memory. All right. So optogenetics is a new field of neuroscience. The genes of light-sensitive plant proteins, for example, are inserted into animal neurons. we're getting better and better at gene manipulation through a process called CRISPR. Have you heard about CRISPR in biology or any of your biology classes? Really interesting. What they had discovered a few years ago was there was a particular bacteria that had the ability to use a molecular knife. So it's a single molecule that could cleave an individual gene or even an individual chromosome out of a strand of DNA and replace it with another gene or another chromosome. And they've learned how to hijack this molecular knife, now humans have, to actually do all kinds of amazing genetic work, like replace defective genes in people who have things like Huntington's disease or have different inherited diseases. They're able to do that. They're also able to turn off genes and turn on genes now with CRISPR. It's getting more and more complex, the different things we're able to do. And we're beginning to get into some real ethical dilemmas about what do you do with this ability. So, you know, like here's an example. You and your partner have decided to have a child, and you're not going to have a child the old-fashioned way. You're going to have a child through in vitro fertilization. And so you're able to see several different embryos that are a combination of both of your genetic profiles. Now you're also now able to sequence the gene profile of each one of these embryos. You know within a certain degree of certainty that embryo 1 has a 50% chance or greater of developing schizophrenia. Embryo 2 has a high degree chance of developing master level musical ability and might be intellectually gifted. Embryo 3 is going to be likely gifted in an athletic sense, might even be an Olympic class person. And then embryo 4, 5, 6, and 7 are just going to be run-of-the-mill average Joes or Janes. So, you know, nothing really special about them. Which embryo do you choose to implant? What would you do? Anybody want to take a stab at it?
I guess the assumption is that most people would go for embryos 2 or 3.
So maybe go for the gifted part, right? That's a hard one. Now, you know, what if you had 3 that were, you know, maybe gifted, maybe average, but 4, 5, and 6, you almost knew by a high degree of certainty we're going to be defective on some level. We're going to have a major inheritable disease, something along those lines. However, the ones that did have a possible major inheritable disease, you also could cure. So, you know, most people think that it's probably okay to use CRISPR or to use any kind of genetic manipulation to, you know, cure Huntington's disease or cystic fibrosis, for example, or some other inheritable genetic disorder. I mean, would anyone disagree with that? Do you think that that's an okay thing to do? Head nod. I can see you, so head nods are okay. But then, you know, what if you're able to enhance a child's ability or potential? So what if you say, well, gosh, you know, if you click on this particular gene, it's going to increase their visual spatial ability, and you turn this gene up a little bit and it's going to increase their verbal ability. And and you turn this gene off, and it's going to not allow muscles to inhibit their growth. And so you're going to get someone who's really strong. You know, would that be okay? Or is that going too far, do you think? Because that's where we're headed. So, you know, those are the kind of ethical dilemmas that you all are going to have to wrestle with as you're going along in your life. So the endocrine system. So how can hormones help me in a crisis? The endocrine system regulates growth and energy consumption, sexual behaviors. It readies your body for action. Different endocrine glands or organs that secrete hormones into the bloodstream, your pituitary gland, ovaries for women, testes for men, secrete hormones that help to foster all kinds of different behaviors and emotional states. Hormones, they stimulate cells that are not directly connected to one another. So some of the major big glands we have is the pituitary, regulates growth, controls the thyroid, your ovaries, your testes. It's known as the master gland, and it regulates a lot of different components and most of your endocrine system. The hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland itself. The thyroid controls the metabolic rate. One of the things that I often do in my private practice as a psychologist is I always ask a person, when is the last time you've had a good physical? Because if there's something wrong with their endocrine system and they have a lower level of thyroid hormone, then sometimes they can look and feel very depressed, but it's not really a psychologically induced depression. It's a biochemical or an endocrine system or a hormonal depression. So once they get their thyroid re-regulated, if that's the issue, the depression goes away. The adrenal cortex, your adrenal glands sit right on top of your kidneys. You need adrenaline because it helps to regulate your carbohydrate, your salt metabolism. It prepares your body for action. It's the one that releases adrenaline into your system and lets you run, or fight, depending on what you need to do. The pancreas controls levels of insulin and regulates your sugar metabolism. Testes in the male is the physical development. More testosterone you have, typically the more aggressive a person becomes, the more muscle mass you have. A lot of positive effects with testosterone. Ovaries, the effects, physical development, releases estrogen as well as testosterone, and male body also makes a certain level of estrogen as well that's needed to carry out all kinds of functions that are going on. All right, well, that's kind of the end of our lecture tonight. Anybody have any questions about anything we've talked about? Or any questions about the class generally? This is a difficult format for me. I think more difficult than a live class, of course, but we seem to be kind of getting through it. I hope you guys aren't going to sleep too much through all this. I try to spice it up with some interesting stories or some funny quips as much as possible. When I get real sleepy, I'll pull my ukulele out. So I apologize for subjecting you to that. If anybody needs anything, please feel free to contact me. Otherwise, if there aren't any questions, I will see you all next Thursday. We'll be back to our regular Thursday class next week. Thanks for your understanding this week. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir. Have a nice day.
You too. See you next week.
Bye.